I meet all kinds of people who don't enjoy what they do. They simply go through their lives getting on with it. They get no great pleasure from what they do. They endure it rather than enjoy it and wait for the weekend. But I also meet people who love what they do and couldn't imagine doing anything else. If you said to them, don't do this anymore, they'd wonder what you were talking about. Because it isn't what they do, it's who they are. They say, but this is me. You know, it would be foolish for me to abandon this because it speaks to my most authentic self. And it's not true of enough people. In fact, on the contrary, I think it's still true of a minority of people. And I think there are many possible explanations for it. And high among them is education. Because education, in a way, dislocates very many people from their natural talents. And human resources are like natural resources. They're often buried deep. You have to go looking for them. They're not just lying around on the surface. You have to create the circumstances where they show themselves. And you might imagine education would be the way that happens, but too often it's not. Every education system in the world is being reformed at the moment, and it's not enough. Reform is no use anymore, because that's simply improving a broken model. What we need, and the word's been used many times during the course of the past few days, is not evolution, but a revolution in education. This has to be transformed into something else. A couple of examples. One of them is the idea of linearity. That it starts here, and you go through a track, and if you do everything right, you will end up set for the rest of your life. Everybody who's spoken at TED has told us implicitly or sometimes explicitly a different story, that life is not linear, it's organic. We create our lives symbiotically as we explore our talents in relation to the circumstances they help to create for us. But you know, we have become obsessed with this linear narrative, and probably the pinnacle for education is getting you to college. I think we are obsessed with getting people to college. Certain sorts of college. I don't mean you shouldn't go to college, but not everybody needs to go, and not everybody needs to go now. Maybe they go later. He said, I was throwing my life away if that's all I chose to do with it. That I should go to college, I should become a professional person, I had great potential, and I was wasting my talent to do that. And he said it was humiliating because he said it in front of the whole class, and I really felt dreadful. But it's what I wanted. And as soon as I left school, I applied to the fire service, and I was accepted. And he said, you know, I was thinking about that guy recently, just a few minutes ago when you were speaking about this teacher. He said, because 6 months ago, I saved his life. He said he was in a car wreck, and I pulled him out, gave him CPR, and I saved his wife's life as well. He said, I think he thinks better of me now. You know what I mean? Human communities depend upon a diversity of talent, not a singular conception of ability. And at the heart of our challenges, at the heart of the challenge is to reconstitute our sense of ability and of intelligence. This linearity thing, the other big issue is conformity. We have built our education systems on the model of fast food. This is something Jamie Oliver talked about the other day. You know, there are two models of quality assurance in catering. One is fast food, where everything is standardized. The other are things like Zagat and Michelin restaurants, where everything is not standardized. They're customized to local circumstances. And we have sold ourselves into a fast food model of education. And it's impoverishing our spirits and our energies as much as fast food is depleting our physical bodies. It did not for me. I could not get this thing to work, you know. No matter how often and how hard I blew into it, you know, it just wouldn't work. But it's not only about that, it's about passion. Often people are good at things they don't really care for. It's about passion and what excites our spirit and our energy. And if you're doing the thing that you love to do, that you're good at, time takes a different course entirely. My wife's just finished writing a novel, and I think it's a great book, but she disappears for hours on end. You know this. If you're doing something you love, an hour feels like 5 minutes. If you're doing something that doesn't resonate with your spirit, 5 minutes feels like an hour. And the reason so many people are opting out of education is because it doesn't feed their spirit. It doesn't feed their energy or their passion. So I think we have to change metaphors. We have to go from what is essentially an industrial model of education, a manufacturing model, which is based on linearity and conformity and batching people. We have to move to a model that is based more on principles of agriculture. We have to recognize that human flourishing is not a mechanical process, it's an organic process. And you cannot predict the outcome of human development. All you can do is, like a farmer, is create the conditions under which they will begin to flourish. So when we look at reforming education and transforming it, it isn't like cloning a system. In this room, there are people who represent extraordinary resources in business, in multimedia, in the internet. These technologies, combined with extraordinary talents of teachers, provide an opportunity to revolutionize education. And I urge you to get involved in it, because it's vital not just to ourselves, but to the future of our children. But we have to change from the industrial model to an agricultural model where each school can be flourishing tomorrow. That's where children experience life, or at home if that's where they choose to be educated with their families or their friends. Private schools have an opportunity and a responsibility. The opportunity is they ordinarily have more resources than public schools. They often have a high level of support from parents, and they have high status and more independence. And what it means is that they are able to experiment and innovate in a way that some people feel in the public sector they cannot. So I encourage them. I think it's important in themselves, but it's also, I believe, important that they see their leadership roles in encouraging innovation across the whole system. Because in the end, it's the public system that has to change. For most children, education is public education. And one of the problems, as I understand it here in Chile, is that the funding systems for education mean that private schools attract a lot of resources. They often attract students who are very committed. And normally what happens when you have a market economy like that in education is that it drains resources of all sorts, financial and human, from the public sector. And it tends to compound the inequality. And for most kids, the opportunity for education is only in the public sector. So I think providing there's a healthy relationship between the public and the private, and providing governments don't bet everything into the private sector, there's every reason to encourage it. But the big agenda has to be, I think, with the improvement of public schools. I believe this fundamentally, that these old political divisions don't help us anymore. I mean, if you think of education, for example, parties on both sides of that divide in most countries don't get it yet. This isn't to me about the Democrats have got it right for education, the Republicans have not. There are people on both sides who I think see the need for change, and people on both sides who simply don't get it at all. I've never found it helpful in education to take that binary divide. But that's true of most areas. It's true of healthcare, it's true of economic development. And certainly what's happening in America, I think, is that our systems of government in America now are inadequate to cope with the changes that we're having to face. They're inadequate structurally, they're inadequate ideologically, and more people are trying to move away from them. They don't vote, they move to other sources of information, they don't trust politicians. I think that's a blight everywhere, that there's a professional class of politicians and people don't believe them for the most part. The thing is, I always believe you need a theory of change. And I think often people believe that change has to wait until the government says okay and approves it. I see it all the time in education. People think, well, we've got to persuade politicians that this is the new course we have to take. And I think it's important that we try to do that. I think it is important that we engage in advocacy, that we aim to persuade our politicians, to inform them. That matters. But it's not enough. On the whole, real change comes from a different direction. It comes from the ground up. It comes from people living a different life, wanting different things, and acting differently themselves. When I did this strategy in the UK 10 years ago, it was commissioned by the government to promote creative education. We did address a lot of recommendations to the government, because there are things governments can do. They need to create a policy framework and a climate. But we addressed a lot of recommendations to school teachers, to principals, to parents, because you can make a change in your own life tomorrow morning. You don't have to wait for permission to do it. And in the end, of course, that's what culture is. It's permission. You know, in some cultures, all cultures give permission to certain things, and they withhold it from certain things. So it is important to encourage politicians along this path, but it's much more important that we also get on and do the things that we think matter for ourselves. And the change is happening. Things are moving in a new direction, and you feel it everywhere. You feel it in the media, you feel it in the way that people live, you feel it in the dissatisfaction that people express with our current institutions. But you know what happens in most paradigm shifts is that people who are part of the old paradigm cling on to it because they're invested in it, and they believe the problem is just that they aren't doing it as well as they used to. So they try to fix the old system. And always in the new paradigm, there are people at the front end who are pushing for the change more quickly. And I think the changes we've been talking about this morning are now inevitable. They're part of the new zeitgeist. And yes, let's encourage the politicians, but let's get on with it ourselves in the meantime. And sensible politicians will approve of it, and they may eventually say it was their idea. And that's fine, we should let them have it.